Hi, and thanks for joining me on my own. Steve Hayes from Element, giving you an update on all things that have been happening in our industry in the last few months and since the last time we did an industry update. So let's get the elephant out of the room first. It's just me today. Michael, my previous colleague, has moved on and is following new ventures with a different company now. So I'll be giving an update on all of the events that have happened in our industry, as I say, in the last few months. And then over a period of time, we'll also see maybe a slightly different format as we go forward and have different colleagues from Element join me and others in this type of forum. So what has happened then? I think previously we've highlighted the fact that twice a year we have our main two events, that being the TCB Council held in the US, which covers the North American requirements, fundamentally based around the USA with the FCC and Canada with ISED Canada, the regulated for those two countries. Those forums, we also get updates from other things that are happening around the world, but those are the two main things. So I'm going to cover that during this update now, and then also from the REDCA. The REDCA is an acronym, if you're not familiar with it. It's the Radio Equipment Directive Compliance Association, and is essentially the same as TCB Council, but from a European perspective rather than from a North American one. We're recording this getting towards the end of 2025, and I'm sat here just a week after, well, the next week, but literally 2 working days after the last of those meetings, that being the REDCA, which was held in Athens just last week. So I've got some notes. The time that we've had to prepare these things has been pretty tight. There's literally been a week gap between the TCB Council and the REDCA. And like always, Element does a lot of the presentations and presents some of the material for these things. And so therefore, forgive me when I'm a little bit looking down at my notes to see what's happened because of being so busy writing some of the material. So I think first thing to say about TCB Council is because of the government shutdown, the biggest government shutdown that the US has ever had, there wasn't attendance from the FCC. That's the headline act. The reality is that actually we did have a couple of people from the FCC join the TCB Council meeting. There's a new chief of the OET, and we're very fortunate enough to have them come along, and a couple of senior people from the FCC as well, including from the legal department. So I'll give an update on that, but normally with the FCC, with the TCB Council, the FCC would give a more comprehensive update. As of recording this, over the weekend, the Republicans and Democrats did come to a deal, and so the government is going back in the US. And as I understand it, the FCC wrote all of those presentations in preparation for TCB Council. And I think there's going to be an online addition to TCB Council to give an update from the FCC. So it might be that we do an interim industry update in the next couple of months once we've received that info from the FCC themselves. The good news is, however, that did give more time for Industry Canada, ISED Canada, to provide an update of all the things that are happening north of the border, as it were. One of those covers RSS 247. 247 is the standard, radio-specific standard for our lands, and noted the fact that in Canada now an extended frequency range has been opened up, that being the 5.6 to 5.65 band, which provides more channels and therefore greater throughput for our lands in Canada itself. Now, by opening up the higher frequency, it starts to sort of bleed into where meteorological radars operate. And one of the things that we've learned in Europe is that when our lands are operating, historically there's been a potential interference with these meteorological radars. So not only has ICED and 247 opened up the band, but in doing so they've introduced a new requirement as well. And that requirement is DFS, or dynamic frequency selection, where the basic principle is it does like a listen before talk type polite spectrum access arrangement, such that interference to the meteorological radars is avoided. The way that RSS 247 has been updated is by using the European ETSI standard 301893 to demonstrate this DFS requirement. That said, the version of 301893 that's being used has now subsequently been updated in Europe, but I'm sure that will in itself get solved out in due course. Another update, not really so much for manufacturers, but all of the test labs that do the testing to support all of this work, is ANSI C63.10. It's an issue for the test labs. It tells us how we do the measurements and all of the technical characteristics around that. And there was a 2023 version that has now been updated by a 2020 version. Now, although I said it's really for the labs to worry about, there is no grandfathering with the testing that's been done. And so essentially that means that when we do testing now, of course we're doing it to the 2020 version, but it does mean that any Class 2 permissive changes or anything like that, we will then have to do additional testing to the newer version of the standard to make sure that it then meets the requirements for ICED itself. There are a load of new RSS standards that have been published. There's a new one, RSS 193, which covers the 27.5 to 28.35 gigahertz band, and then a load of other ones. So 195, 288, 119, 252, RSS Gen and RSS 102. They've all been updated. I'm not going to go into the details of those, but in terms of frequency ranges or technologies that they cover, GMDSS, CV2X for anybody that's making cellular vehicle to infrastructure communication. All of those sorts of products are covered by those updates. So if any of those sound familiar to you, go and check them out. They're all available on the ICED Canada website. And here's the thing, ICED Canada are trialling out not publishing direct PDF versions themselves. So the website holds the current valid edition of that standard. And it has been updated, the website, to allow you to print to PDF directly from the website, but you can't go looking for a PDF document because the HTML page itself is the official document. So just be aware of that if you going there and looking for any of the info. There were presentations from industry. I'm moving on beyond ICED now in terms of the wider TCB Council. Some really interesting presentations on some research that's been done as we move higher up in frequency in terms of RF exposure measurements. And up to 6 gigahertz we do a SAR measurement. Above 6 gigahertz we're doing a power density measurement. But some of the presentations were really into the sort of the biomedical side of this, and what are we actually testing for, and looking at the depth that skin and tissue will be affected when we start using RF products in close proximity to the human body. So some really interesting work that's been done there, which ultimately will result in updated procedures in due course, and perhaps updated tests as well as we understand more about this. Highlighted around the fact that for some technologies and some frequency ranges, testing might not be the solution. And in fact, simulations are something that we're going to have to really focus on going forward to substitute physical test. But of course, one of the key things about any simulation is relating that back to the real world situation. So some interesting presentations around simulation as well. One of my colleagues, Justin, he provided an update on the latest HAC or Hearing Aid Compatibility requirements and highlighted the enhanced requirements, if you like, with a new version of the HAC standard itself. If anybody wants more information about that, then within Element, that's some of the work that we're leading, and just reach out to us and we can provide some more information. I think we also have a white paper on that new standard as well. We had some really interesting presentations from various different industry partners. So CPRAV down in Australia gave an update on updated requirements for Australia and India and some other countries around the world. And then Approve It, the GMA specialist, provided an update on, actually they focused on Latin America and all the differing Wi-Fi regulations or regulatory requirements for Wi-Fi in various different Latin American countries. So that was really interesting. You might think that if you designed a Wi-Fi product and it's good for the US, that it should be good around the whole of South America as well, and that's really not the case. So that was a really interesting presentation. Another presentation about updated requirements in South Korea as well for radio products. Then we get on to the C word, cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is dominating conversations both in North America, Europe, and actually pretty much globally now. And so in TCB Council, we received updates. So Michael, my previous colleague, gave an update on some of the discussions that we've been having here in Europe about the RED Delegation Act. And then we also had presentation from Keysight on some of the real detail about how you go about understanding what builds a cybersecurity test and assessment schedule, and introduce the concept of SBOMs or software bill of materials to us as industry partners. Something that I can imagine that we will be focusing on as we go forward. This is Element I'm talking about, as we start evolving our cyber test and assessment requirements and evolving that into things like the CRA in Europe as well, the Cyber Resilience Act. So really interesting. And then we also got an update on progress with the Cyber Trust Mark. I think that's hit a bit of a road bump at the moment in terms of it rolling out. But I can imagine now the US government is back behind their desk, then that I'm sure we'll see some progress of that in due course. I gave an update to TCB Council on an issue that we have in Europe relating to performance criteria. Used an example for EMC performance criteria, but equally it could apply to receiver performance as well. And just highlighting why the European Commission has put some restrictions in the official journal in EU and what that really means. I'll talk about that a little bit more detail, I guess, when I start talking about REDCA. Then I guess one of the hot topics was around FCC and Bad Labs. And we hear a lot about FCC Bad Labs. The reality is that these labs aren't necessarily bad. I don't think there's any evidence to say that they're bad at all. It's to do with the ownership structure of labs which are based in or have ownership from a Chinese banned company or something, a company that's fallen out of favour with the FCC. A foreign adversary is what they're referred to. So we have a list of covered products and manufacturers that are on those, and some of those are sort of well known. And I'm not sharing any secrets, but manufacturers like Huawei, for example, were already on the covered list. Kaspersky, from a software antivirus side, are already on that list. The FCC is now looking to extend the list of manufacturers on that covered list to other Chinese adversary manufacturers as well. And so watch out for that. And the reason I say watch out for it is because it may be that manufacturers of host equipment are buying radio modules and embedding them in their product. And the FCC has made it clear that any of these radio modules which are on the covered list, we as a TCB won't be able to do the final approval or certification of those devices if they integrate or have inside them some of these radio modules that I've talked about. So that's important that manufacturers are aware of that because it could affect the compliance of your product. And in fact, the FCC also talked about the possibility of going back and looking at already approved products, so this grandfathering that typically exists in the US, going back and actually withdrawing approval potentially for some of those products as well that have got those radio modules integrated into them. So just going back to the whole Bad Labs thing then, and this sort of word foreign adversary, it's to do with the ownership of the lab itself. And if 10% of that is owned by a foreign adversary, then they are then put on the Bad Labs list. As I say, it's got nothing to do with the lab and their integrity at all. It's to do with the ownership structure. And we had presentations from both pro and against this whole covered list and Bad Labs. And it was quite interesting. And I'm not sure if it is politically motivated, but I'm not entirely sure whether it'll end up in having the outcome that some people want. I think some people are hoping that it will bring more testing back to the US. But clearly, if you've got manufacturers in Asia, and there's other countries in Asia that can do and are accredited to do this testing, maybe they will be the net beneficiary rather than that work come over to the US because of the potential cost differentiation, although that's often offset by the sort of technical know-how as well. So that's already come into force. It came into force in September this year. So be aware of that and pay attention because it could catch you out. Just going to have a slurp of my coffee. Okay. Yeah, so that was the TCB Council. Have a week off. And now we have the REDCA. REDCA was last week, November 2025. Number of the same faces there, but now we're really talking about a European focus. And so we had I think it was the first time that there was such a thing, but a keynote speech, and it was done by Paul Didcott, who looks after product compliance for Lenovo, the IT manufacturer. And it was quite a thought-provoking presentation, actually, in terms of looking back over the last 20 years or so in terms of the amount of regulations that apply to their sort of products. So in 2005, there were about 4 bits of legislation that applied to, I guess, maybe something like a laptop or something like that, you know, safety, EMC, radio. And over the next 20 years, so bringing it all the way through to 2025, that 4 pieces of legislation has now gone up to 32 bits of different legislation applying to those same types of products. So it was a bit of a sort of an eye-opening moment to realise that for a manufacturer, it's not just about designing a product these days. It's once you've designed a product and it functionally works, you're actually only about halfway to getting your product onto the market, because the other 50% is all of this legislation that you have to comply with. And of course, we've got more sophisticated radio products that have been, designed in over the period of time, but we've also got environmental legislation and making sure that we don't have banned substances in there, that the chemicals are not going to be harmful, that we label it that it's a particular type of charger or interface that's on the product. So it was a really eye-watering moment in terms of, wow, that's just so much legislation that you've got to comply with. And I think maybe I'll reflect on that, and I think maybe I'm going to use that as something to sort of do some more material around, because I think the danger is all of this legislation is well intended, but when you've got 32 pieces of legislation that one single product needs to comply with, if you think about it from a small or medium-sized enterprise perspective, the cost of getting a product to market now would be really very expensive and very time-consuming. And that's sort of one of the reasons why we had CE marking brought in originally. It was to reduce time to market, test it, certify it once, and have access to all of these European countries. And we've sort of swapped that for now increase the amount of legislation that it has to comply with. And so for an SME, the cost of getting a product to market may be so horrendously expensive it stifles innovation, which absolutely is not the intent, but it's an undesired outcome of adding so much legislation. Now, the good news is Paul summarised his presentation by suggesting that perhaps that will fall back to 19 pieces of legislation in due course, but equally the volume has gone up and there's no getting away from that. So that was a key presentation that we had right at the beginning of the meeting. And then we went into our sort of regular cadence of having updates from the various different stakeholders. I guess for us, from a test and certification perspective, the most important ones are what the European Commission's got to say. They're the lawmakers, they write the regulations, and that's our early warning indicator of what's coming down the tracks that we need to be aware of ourselves, and why I'm sat here in front of the camera talking to you, to make you aware of it, because it's going to apply to you in due course. So the first one was on the CRA, the Cyber Resilience Act. Cyber Resilience Act is a piece of legislation that comes into force at the end of 2027, but actually has some reporting requirements that come in 2026. So I guess the first thing that I wanted to highlight that is a takeaway from that presentation is, don't be fooled by the 2027 date. There are requirements for manufacturers from 2026 onwards. So you need to be aware of that in terms of reporting vulnerabilities and those sorts of things. The other thing for those that are less familiar with the Cyber Resilience Act that you need to be aware of is that it applies to, yes, hardware, but also software. And when we say software, we're talking about operating systems, Word documents or systems and those sorts of things as well. So the scope of the CRA is really quite wide, and we as Element are going to be doing a lot of work and putting quite a bit of material out about this over the next year or so, because it's probably the most significant bit of legislation to affect our industry for quite a number of years. So the CRA, I just highlighted, covers both hardware and software. Unlike the Radio Equipment Directive Delegated Act for Cyber, the RED Delegated Act talks about placing products on the market. So comply and meet the cyber requirements when you place the product on the market. The CRA is actually a piece of legislation that covers the life cycle of the product itself. So how are you doing software updates? How are you going to comply with the CRA during the lifetime of the product? And this is something that manufacturers need to be thinking about. I mentioned reporting that comes in towards the end of 2026. And again, for manufacturers, that's something that you need to be ready for in terms of how you're going to report it. Who are you going to report it to? And that's some of the work that the European Commission's doing behind the scenes in preparation for some of this stuff. And then also in terms of enforcement. How would this new legislation be enforced? What are they going to be looking at? And that's something the European Commission is also working through as well. One of the things that they're working on are, where are the standards? How do you demonstrate compliance? I'll talk about that. But before I do, I guess just introduce the categories of products. So there's basically 4 categories of products for the CRA. There are default products, where a self-assessment by manufacturers is perfectly acceptable. And they're things like memory chips and smart speakers and those sorts of things. Then there are Class 1 products, which allows manufacturers to do their own assessment, but then their homework or the assessment is then checked by a notified body. And those sorts of products would be maybe routers, firewalls, those sorts of things. Class 2 products as well, where the notified body is required to do the testing and the assessment. So even if a manufacturer has done their testing, I think in the European Commission's eyes, the notified body needs to be responsible for the testing and do some of the testing themselves. I think we've got to work through that yet as to what that really means, and so there's going to be some onward conversation with the European Commission itself about that. And then there's the final category of products, which are critical ones. So things like smart cards, secure elements within products themselves, smart meters, those things that process monetary transactions and personal information, those sorts of highly critical devices. And then there's an interaction between those and the AI Act as well. And again, I'm not going to dwell on that now, but that's some of the material that will come down the track in due course. So much more significant input actually from notified bodies, and really from a notified body point of view, having to do some of the testing as well. So we need to see really the detail of that. Now, in terms of the testing itself, what does that actually mean? For those that are familiar and doing cyber assessments already under the Radio Equipment Directive, you know that we've got 3 basic standards which are listed in the official journal. We have EN 18031 series, Part 1, 2 and 3 for generic requirements, if you like, personal information, monetary transactions and avoiding a fraud. Under the CRA, there's going to be a whole load of new standards. Generic standards are okay for the Radio Equipment Directive, Delegated Act, but the Commission doesn't want these generic requirements under the CRA. So they are preparing and have issued a standardisation request to, in this particular case, Senelec, the European standards writer, and they're busy now writing both these vertical standards, which you could think as product-specific standards, and then also horizontal standards, which are common requirements that sit across each of these end markets or product-specific standards. And so there's going to be about 15 horizontal standards and somewhere in the order of sort of 20 or so vertical standards. And the idea is that these vertical standards will increase over the course of time as well. So a tremendous amount of work that's needed by the Senelec groups writing those things. Again, Element, we have people involved in that standards writing process, and we'll hope to keep you up to date as those standards evolve over due course. Next presentation we had was from the another European Commission one, from the RED Desk Officer, who gave us an update on all things to do with the Radio Directive, noting the fact that we had an official journal update on the 14th of May this year, 2025, and then another one on the 13th of August this year. And then there's going to be a new official journal for the Radio Directive listing, and that's likely to be in December 2025. So an early Christmas present for a number of manufacturers. And there's got a whole tranche of new standards there that will be listed. The majority of those are radio, so Article 3.2 related, but I did see that there was a couple of EMC standards that are going to be cited as well. If you want any information about that, if it's important to you, then reach out to us. Otherwise, I'm sure we'll do an update when the official journal's updated as well. Talked about common charger. So common charger is the requirement for standardising the power and interface port for a number of devices, notably smartphones, where obviously we've standardised on a USB-C. The basic standard for a USB-C has been updated. So the official journal has to be updated to reflect the new versions of the ESB, USB functional specifications, and then also highlighting that there's going to be updated labelling requirements for chargers. So we've got the 15 to 45 watt label that will be affixed to chargers, but then there's the above 45 watt chargers that are being rolled out as well, which typically will do power delivery. Different label depending upon the power capability of the charger itself. Also highlighted that the scope of the common charger requirements will be updated in terms of what type of products. So at the moment it is mainly focused around smartphones, but talking about it being updated to include things like gaming controllers, AR, VR headsets, and a whole tranche of new types of products as well. And then also the possible inclusion of taking the wire away and having wireless chargers integrated into the common charger requirements as well. So that was something that was highlighted. And is also linked to the unbundling requirement. So unbundling, which means that at the moment you buy charger and cable. What happens if you buy those separately? Does the cable not need to be certified, and how do you deal with that? So those requirements coming along, or clarifications. And then also RRS, so Reconfigurable Radio Systems. So under the Radio Directive, it's the combination of hardware and software that has to be in compliance with the directive itself. But if we think about products and how they evolve after we buy them, for example, my phone is regularly getting a software update, and the directive says, well, you need to make sure that if there's a software update, if that software could affect the radio EMC safety characteristics of that product, then you need to do an additional assessment. And so there was concern that manufacturers or even end users would be able to get into the operating system or BIOS or hard firmware and change some of those software defined filters, for example, and affect the compliance of the product. The Commission's done a study on that, and I don't think they meant to belittle the issue, but actually the number of instances where that occurs is relatively small and probably doesn't warrant any further work at the moment. So they're keeping a watching brief on it, but I don't think that we can expect any updates on reconfigurable radio systems anytime soon. Yeah, so on to other topics now from other presenters. We had our regular update from ETSI on all of the things that they're doing in terms of Article 3.2 and 3.3 standards. So that was very well received. A lot of work being done in ETSI on preparing new standards and understanding the European Commission's requirements in terms of what needs to go into these standards to enable them to get cited in the official journal as harmonised standards. There's an interesting topic that came as a result of that, actually, which was around the terminology of harmonised standards. So we have harmonised standards published by ETSI, and then we have harmonised standards cited in the official journal of the European Commission. And so both are called harmonised standards, but we need to differentiate because only those that are listed in the official journal give a presumption of conformity, whereas the other harmonised standards that ETSI produce do not provide a presumption of conformity, and in the case of radio and cyber, those are the ones that you would need a notified body as well. So interesting discussion and update from ETSI. We then had an update from all of the different leaders of our different working groups who prepare TGNs, or technical guidance notes. So this is where either there's ambiguity in the standard, or people are doing different things, people interpret stuff in different way, and we think as an industry that a TGN will be a useful addition to help the understanding for everybody and create a common playing field that we all assess against. So we've got new TGNs coming along for cyber. They weren't at the point where they were presented for vote. And the reason for that was not that they're not mature documents, but actually the ADCO, the people who do the enforcing of and market surveillance for the directive itself, are in the process of producing an updated RED guide. And one of the issues related to cyber is, what does internet connected really mean? And it's a question that's vexed many notified bodies and the whole industry really since the Delegated Act was published. And the new draft RED guide is meant to provide some improved clarity, I guess, in terms of helping us understand what that is. So we're waiting for the draft guide to be circulated, and hopefully the guide itself, and then assuming that aligns with what's been written into the TGNs, then all of the cyber TGNs will then get published. Because of cyber, we have TGN 01, which is on radio modules, and that's just in the process of being updated to reflect the new cyber requirements coming in. And then we have TGN 20, which is on SAR, 29, which is on type examination certificates and updates to those, 30 on risk assessments, and 33 on radio equipment in vehicles. All of those documents have either been recently published or in the process of being updated. All of those TGNs are available actually on the REDCA website to download. So if you wanted to go and have a look at any of those, then go over to redca.eu and there's a documents area there, and you'll be able to find those and download them. We also had update from ADCO RED. ADCO RED, I just mentioned a few moments ago, are in the process of updating the RED guide, so it's eagerly awaited, but the draft should be circulated to stakeholders shortly for comment, and I think the ADCO themselves are hoping to publish that by the end of 2025. That might be a little bit optimistic, so probably 2026 timeframe is more realistic of when we're looking at. The ECO, the European Communications Office, provide an update on the work that they're doing. So that's part of CEPT, looking at international frequency assignments and allocations, and then ultimately preparing ECC decisions and recommendations, which also then flow into updated ETSI standards and new standards as well. So an update on there. I gave an update on the IEC and CISPRA standards, which are changing. IEC had their general meeting in October this year in New Delhi, India, and provide an update on some of the big high-level topics that we talked about and agreed during that discussion forum. Then we also had an update from DSPR and MIC on Japanese radio regulations and updates to their standards as well. So really quite a lot going on in the industry. That's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, a high-level summary of a number of the discussions. If you look out for our also updated videos, we're doing a number of shorter ones and some white papers that will result from some of the activities that we've been talking about on this little video. So look out for those, and we'll do those as separate documents. But for the time being, thanks for listening, and see you on the next one. Take care.